Respected Swamiji, distinguished principal and faculty, and my dear students, and a very special welcome to the students who are coming from outside Vivekananda College as well. I'm very happy to be here, and it is indeed a great pleasure to be here, to be back to my college, a college which has shaped both me and my thinking and my life. And I thank Swamiji, the principal, Professor Vagisan, for inviting me to speak on the impact of geopolitics on global trade. I commend the Commerce Department for taking this initiative to organize this intercollegiate seminar on the topic of importance and interest. And I'm very happy that we have several colleges participating today. When we study global trade, commerce, economics in our classrooms, we tend to assume a few things as constant, and that the variable factors which we usually factor in are cost, price, market factors, economic and financial variables, trade barriers, etc. But in the real world, especially in the recent past, conflicts and wars, or political instability, or the pandemic like COVID, or major political events have had a very significant impact on global trade and, in fact, on the global economy. This is especially true after 2017, after the US-China trade war during President Trump's first term. Then we had the impact of COVID on the world economy. Then the fallout from the Ukraine war. Then we had the fallout from the global war on global trade and economy. Earlier, you would all recall, we also saw something called the Brexit. You may be familiar with it, where the United Kingdom broke off with the European Union. And this was another geopolitical shock. So why I'm mentioning all this is that understanding the link between geopolitics and trade has become vital in the last decade or so, whenever one makes not just trade-related decisions, but also decisions on a range of economic-related issues. And to understand this linkage between geopolitics and global trade, I'd like to give you some examples, and after that, discuss where India stands on this issue. Now, at the beginning, let me give you a hypothetical example. As you may all know, one of the potential geopolitical flashpoints for a war is a possible war between China and Taiwan. They are not at war with each other, but I'm just giving you a hypothetical example. China has always claimed that the unfinished agenda is to annex Taiwan and reunite China into one, while Taiwan, on the other hand, is aiming towards its recognition as a separate country. So for this so-called reunification, China has stated that it is even prepared to use force if necessary. Now, in such a potential scenario of a Taiwan-China conflict, or even a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, what happens to India? Because for us, we are not thinking of China and Taiwan as of now. But in a scenario like that, what happens to India? Now, a former colleague of mine, who was also the former Foreign Secretary, Vijay Gokhale, he has done an excellent study on what will happen in the case of a China-Taiwan clash. And this is what he surmises from his study, and I would like to give a sense of what he says. See, India, as you all know, adopted the Act East policy, and its geopolitical and economic engagement has increased exponentially with countries in the East, especially in the Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, Japan, South Korea, and the oceanic states. And according to a study, the CSIS study, India's total trade through the South China Sea, which you may all know is one of the most hotly contested regions of the world. Now, the total trade through the South China Sea was 123 billion in 2008, and it grew to 208 billion US dollars by 2016, which is an increase of 80% in just 8 years. And I'm talking about 2016. And this accounted for more than 30% of all our trade in goods. And since 2016, I'm sure both the volume and percentage of Indian trade passing through the South China Sea has increased even more than what we see in 2016. And a big chunk of our trade goes through South China Sea. So first and foremost, a China-Taiwan conflict would seriously impede trade through South China Sea. And this will severely impact key sectors in India, which, as I said, we have nearly 30% of our trade going through it. Further, Mr. Gokhale's study quotes another one from the Rhodium Group in 2022. And they say that Taiwan produces 92% of the world's most advanced logic chips, and between 30 to 50% of the global output in less sophisticated but still very critical chips which are required. So a blockade of Taiwan by China would severely disrupt semiconductor exports to India, which is once again a very important aspect of our economic growth. Now, apart from these two very obvious examples, given the experience, you have all seen what has happened to Ukraine after Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, similarly, if the Taiwan-China conflict takes place, West will impose sanctions on China. When the sanctions are imposed on China, then it will further affect India in various ways. First, it will affect all the economic activity between India and Northeast Asia, like Japan and South Korea, because the Taiwan Straits will be closed for commercial shipping. And according to one estimate, nearly 50% of the global container shipping passes through Taiwan Strait. Second, like it is happening in the Ukraine war, banks which are doing business with China will also be sanctioned, which once again will disrupt global trade finance. China accounts for 12% of the global trade, and about half of China's exports represent extremely important parts of the global supply chains. Third, when supply chain disruptions impact globally, India will also be hit. Since we import critical raw materials from China for our industry, for example, pharmaceuticals, electronic equipment, and a whole lot of others for us come from China. Fourth, the chips shortage would disrupt the global electronic, automotive, and computing worlds. And fifth, and this is equally important, now, Taiwan is an important hub for submarine cables. You are aware of submarine cables. 15 major submarine cables that the virtual world which you are all dealing with, 15 of these cables have Taiwan as a mode. If the cable security is affected, there will be a significant reduction and disruption to the global digital flows. And this global trade shock will deeply impact not only our manufacturing sector in India, but also e-commerce, IT-enabled services, logistics, entertainment, and all the other service industries, which potentially will lead to unemployment for millions in India and maybe even a recession. So why I'm mentioning is that a study estimates that the annual disruption of a simple thing like blockading Taiwan by China would mean a global annual economic loss of 3% of the world GDP. So, and we have several other estimates. And therefore, I think it's very obvious that something like this happening, which we are not aware of and we don't know the politics of these issues, but which can happen somewhere in the neighborhood or even beyond our neighborhood, can cost a huge chunk of India's GDP, a huge chunk of India's global trade, and it will have catastrophic consequences for India. Now, this is to give you an idea of the huge impact which it will have. But there are also two other political aspects which are facing us. You are familiar with it. One is the Ukraine war and the other is the Gaza war, which is happening. Now, this type of impact of geopolitics on trade is because the world is far more globalized and far more interconnected now than ever before in history. And that is why when you step into the real world and look at global trade or global economy, you will need to study the global vulnerabilities or geopolitical vulnerabilities also, which affects the entire supply chain and, of course, its risks. So friends, you would have followed the huge disruption globally due to the Ukraine war. That's something you're all familiar with. You see it in the papers. And the difficulties which Ukraine war is posed to the Indian economy. Now, the Russia-Ukraine war started, as you all know, in February 2022, when Russia, which is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, went to war in the heart of Europe. In this war, several countries actively got involved on both sides, and that is why we call it a proxy war, where Ukraine is actually fighting Russia, but most of Europe and the United States are actively supplying arms to the Ukrainian side. But what is truly unfortunate in this is that everything has been weaponized, including trade and commerce, even sports. And the unilateral sanctions which has been imposed on Russia has caused huge difficulties for developing countries in a range of issues with respect to food, energy, oil, fertilizers, etc. In fact, it is not even just developing countries which are affected. Many of you have seen in the media that Germany, which relies on the gas from Russia through what is called the Nord Stream pipeline, and this carries natural gas from Russia to Germany. This pipeline was sabotaged by one of Germany's own ally. And of course, who that ally is your guess, is as good as mine. But the reason is that Germany was not initially willing to support the Europeans to arm Ukraine. So one of their own allies sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline to make sure that Germany did not get natural gas from Russia. So this is geopolitics for you. But the sanctions on Ukraine has directly affected India's energy security. The sanctions on Russian oil, which the EU and the Americans had, it hit Russian oil exports, and the global price of petroleum soared to more than $80 per barrel. As you all know, India imports more than 87% of our oil requirements. So it makes us extremely vulnerable to any fluctuation in global oil prices. So if we had buckled down under these sanctions, and if we had gone to UAE or Saudi Arabia or even the United States for our oil exports, the global price of oil would have definitely gone beyond $100 per barrel because of the pressure on limited supply and increasing demand. This is something you already know. But what India decided is, we decided we will ignore the sanctions which has been imposed on Russia by the West. And that is why we kept our inflation in check, we kept our trade balance in check, and our economy continued to do well. So we even kept the global price of oil less because we started buying from Russia. And you will recall a similar situation. Why I'm mentioning that we decided to ignore the sanctions is that there was a case when we were also slapped with sanctions, the whole world. US imposed sanctions on Iran after the United States abrogated the nuclear deal with Iran. Now, at that time, India actually decided to respect the sanctions. So we were buying about 10 to 12% of our oil from Iran. And because of the sanction, we had to bring down the oil purchase from Iran to 0%. And this, of course, hit us very badly. And we had to get oil from the United Arab Emirates and the United States. And fortunately, we did not suffer because we did not pay such a huge price. So when the United States and the West wanted us to do the same thing with Russia, we decided enough was enough. And Russia has now become our biggest crude oil supplier. Now, one of the things which President Trump is insisting is that India should buy more oil from the United States because we have a huge trade deficit with the United States. So now we may actually start buying oil from the US. So that is why I'm mentioning this is all geopolitics. It is nothing to do with prices. It is nothing to do with supply and demand curves. It is everything to do with geopolitics. And prices are important, but they become secondary when it comes to geopolitical pressure. Now, you have seen the spat between the United States and China, and this was during the first term of President Trump. And what was happening is because of this, national security can also get compromised, and trade can get fragmented. Trade and foreign direct investment flows are now gradually being diverted through geopolitical lines. And we have a term for this, maybe you're familiar with it. It is called friend shoring. Friend shoring in trade is basically companies and governments shifting their manufacturing or sourcing of supply chains to countries which are politically aligned with them, or they are geopolitical friends. So by doing this, they seek to reduce the geopolitical risks, reduce the pressure on their national security, and they enhance supply chain resilience and supply chain security, because cost here becomes secondary. As far as trade is concerned, for example, China's share in US imports declined by 8% between 2017 and 2023, while the US share in China's exports dropped by 4% during the same period. Now, the direct trade between Russia and the West has actually collapsed completely due to the Ukraine war. Now, corporate entities and businesses are actually broad-basing their supply chains, and they are looking at, as I said, friend-shoring, near-shoring, decoupling, de-risking, etc. However, we must be aware of one important thing. Trade fragmentation, undoing of trade relations between countries, undoing of globalization comes at a very huge cost, since at the start of the Cold War, goods trade to GDP was only 16%. Now, goods trade to GDP is now 45%. That means a very big chunk of our economies depend on trade. So, while increased tensions and tariff war between China and the US have resulted in reduction of trade between the two regions, the reality is that the sheer size of the Chinese manufacturing output, their capacity, and the enormous efficiency which they have, this is going to be extremely hard to substitute. So let us be also clear-eyed about some of these things. Now, as I mentioned, a way to circumvent sanctions or tariffs and non-tariff barriers is to reroute trade and investment to the same destination but through a third-party country. Now, countries like Mexico, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, they have all emerged of what is called connector countries. And India hopes to capitalize on this as well. You are witnessing the phenomena of what is called China plus one, which is moving away from China into a country, which is that plus one, which has a stable and friendly relationship with the West for exports, even while they maintain a presence in China. That's what we call it as China plus one. Now, an analysis was conducted to explore the implications of the Ukraine war on exports, what we call as a Euro area exports. We find that the Ukraine war has reduced Euro area exports to Russia by more than half. But interestingly, while the direct exports to Russia has decreased, the exports to the countries neighboring Russia has increased from the West, which only shows that things are maybe still going to Russia, but it is going through other countries. The supply chains are being reordered. Now, interestingly, this has not had much of an impact on China, which shows very clearly that China's market power and their staying power. Now, I wanted to give you an example with respect to India. How dependent can one become is seen in the recent conflict between India and China in Galwan. You are aware of it. Galwan in June 2020, when many of the soldiers of both countries lost their lives. For nearly 4 years after that, our two soldiers were actually standing eyeball to eyeball on the border. And India even banned Chinese applications like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, etc. But during these 4 years, when we were in conflict with China on the border, our overall trade with China actually increased. Our imports from China increased from $70 billion in 2018-2019 to a record $101 billion in 23-24. And our trade deficit with China also reached record levels of $85 billion in 2024. So what does this mean? This means that even when we have conflicts with China, India is either unable or unwilling to de-risk or decouple its trade with China, since many of our critical supplies, whether in chemicals and pharma or electrical and electronic goods and renewable energy goods or machinery or minerals or plastics, they all come from China to India. For example, China recently had export curbs on critical minerals, and this disrupted India's electronics, solar, and electric vehicle sector. So now there are Chinese companies which are coming to India and they are setting up shop in India. So automatically you can assume that the imports from China will only go up. These are geopolitical vulnerabilities we need to address with China, a country with whom we have adversarial relations. Now I'm just giving you a sense of that it can happen to any country. The other phenomena which we are seeing now, and which probably you're seeing in the papers, is that some countries are even taking a relook how to bring down their dependence on US dollar in international trade transactions and also in their reserve holdings. For the China bloc, if I may use the word bloc, the US dollar share of trade finance payments has declined since 2022. At the same time, the Chinese yuan has more than doubled from around 4% to 8%. And as of now, there is more of trading in local currencies, and there is not as much as a move to replace the US dollar as such. But this is a trend which will slowly start picking up momentum. Friends, coming to what is happening right now in geopolitics, most of you are now, of course, have your own views about President Trump and what he is doing and how he is shaking up the world and things like that. And it's always interesting to wake up and see what President Trump is doing. But actually, let me put it this way. President Trump has been extremely transparent about what he wants to do right from the beginning of his first term, whether with respect to Russia or with respect to Europe, or what he wants to do with NATO or with Israel or with China, or even his withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, from the World Health Organization, and even on his domestic issues. So, Mr. President Trump has been a bit of an open book. And if we have not read him rightly, it's our fault, not his. He could not achieve fully many of what he wanted to do in his first term. And consequently, he has started doing it in his second term. and he's taking off from where he left off in his first term. And this time he has a very strong team to implement his agenda. But the difference is that this time he has to contend with the Ukraine war, which complicates his move for rapprochement with Russia. And he also has a Gaza war now, which complicates his Middle East policy and his Iran policy. Now, I am also equally convinced that unlike his last term, he will do a deal with China this time around. And this deal will not just be a trade deal, it will go beyond this. And US has also started withdrawing from some of the regions. For example, in Afghanistan, his move to withdraw from Afghanistan, actually it started with President Trump, even though President Biden did the withdrawal. Now, when you withdraw from these geographical areas, what you do is that America cedes space to China. And therefore, there will be an additional geopolitical fallout from this. Therefore, his actions on a variety of fronts, and combined with his complete disregard for multilateral bodies like the United Nations, it will only result in fragmentation of geopolitics, security, trade, and economic architecture of the world. Now, in this global reset by President Trump, Europe and NATO should be very concerned. Since what US is basically saying is that it will no longer bankroll their security in Europe, or it will not mollycoddle their economies. They are being pushed to take more financial and economic responsibility on these counts. And they are being warned of the danger to their own societies. As you've seen in Munich, the Vice President of the United States, Vance, warned Europe of its intolerance to rise of their right-wing parties or their out-of-control migration, which starts endangering their own democratic polity, freedoms, and fundamental values. On the other hand, what you may also have to look at is the so-called no-limits partnership. This is a partnership forged between Russia and China. It's called the no-limits partnership. And this is a huge geopolitical step which China and Russia have taken. And they took it before the Ukraine war. So when you look around you at the regional conflicts which is raging in Europe and West Africa and West Asia and in Africa, you realize that the international law is being violated with impunity and without accountability. The so-called Western values are being violated by the West themselves. You see that in Gaza, you see that in Ukraine. But you also see that in elsewhere. You're following news from Syria, in Sudan, or in Haiti. Democracy is being subverted. And you see that in our own neighborhood, in Afghanistan, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar. And earlier you also saw in Sri Lanka when this famous Argalaya protests by the people took place. And terrorism has become even worse, especially in Africa. And even now, just look at it, after the ceasefire in Gaza, even after 50,000 Palestinians have been killed by the Israelis in Gaza, even now you are having issues of blockade, issues of medicine not going in, humanitarian aid not going into Gaza. Now, thanks to Trump, at least a ceasefire was reached in Gaza. And I just wanted to see 2 days ago or yesterday, you saw in the papers that the Americans have bombed the Houthis. Houthis are those in Yemen, in northern Yemen. Now, it is very simple. The Houthis have been attacking shipping lines which do trade. And because of them, 75% of the US and EU trade to Asia is now coming through Africa, which means that for every vessel which comes to Africa from that region, $1 million additional amount has to be paid. And that payment, that impact on trade is being paid by you and me because we are the consumers. So this is the world you're inheriting today. And it's important that you are not oblivious to these developments. And of course, when you talk about Trump, people say, oh, he's very transactional, he's only bothered about money and a whole lot of things. But be very careful. Don't get carried away by all this clutter and rhetoric. It's important to understand what the President Trump and the United States is trying to do. The America First policy of Trump administration is focusing on securing the best interests for the United States of course, primarily in the economic and trade sphere. The recently released 2025 trade policy of the United States spells out a lot of these things. Now, in order to secure these priorities, the US is using tariffs as a weapon to balance any unfair advantage which other countries may have, and also try and relocate industries to the United States. And people have said, if US raises tariffs against Mexico or China or Canada, it may end up hurting the United States itself. A lot of people say that, and frankly, that may be true. But what President Trump is basically forcing is, he's forcing them to renegotiate the deal. Since tariffs will adversely affect these countries also. So I think the underlining text is reciprocity. And this President Trump is going to apply to India as well. It doesn't matter you are a friend or a foe, or you are a developed or a developing country. The touchstone will be reciprocity. And that reciprocity will be one which will ensure that you get a deal with the United States. I just wanted to point out how interconnected the world is. The BMW car. It's a German car. Now, I was just mentioning, before coming here, that the BMW production units in Europe are being hit by tariffs from the United States. Now, BMW produces these cars in Europe, but they also produce the same cars in US factories also. They are not hit. But the same car exported from Europe is hit by American tariffs. Now, BMW also has factories in China. Now, the export of BMW cars from China to Europe is hit by tariffs, because Europe is imposing tariffs on automobiles from China. So the same car is hit by tariffs from China to Europe. The same car is hit by tariffs from Europe to US. And this is how the tariff war starts. And tomorrow, when you are going to buy a BMW car from outside, you know where you are paying all the money for. And it is going to basically all these tariffs which are coming in the way. So I think the deal with Russia, which is what now the Trump administration is looking at, is going to be one which will be a comprehensive one. It will be a political one. It will be a security one. And I think these are all important geopolitical changes that are going to happen, which is important for you to understand. Friends, as far as India is concerned, Prime Minister Modi, his visit to the United States has been, in my opinion, very timely. And we have certainly impressed on the United States the importance that we continue to attach to our bilateral relations. And we have reinforced our readiness to work on a range of bilateral issues. And we have brought ourselves some breathing space on trade and other economic issues. And the good news is that US and India has a very wide-ranging partnership. But what India does in the next few days and the next few months is going to have a major impact on our bilateral relations with the United States. Because what we have done is we have agreed to sign what is called a bilateral trade agreement with the United States in the next few months. For this to come about, India has to make changes to its tariff structures. And whether you like it or not, Indian tariff structures are high, they are restrictive, they have protectionist overtones, and they are pretty complex to navigate. So this relook is necessary for India's own ambition for high growth and to potentially become a China +1, and not merely to address American pressure. And President Trump is supposed to visit India for what is called the Quad Summit later in the year. Quad are 4 countries. It comprises of the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. So I'm sure that the pressure is now on India to make sure that we have this deal, the bilateral deal, happen before he comes. At least have what is called the early harvest deal. And so therefore, let's see how it pans out. And just if the US-China deal comes through, it may come through sooner than you expect, then there will be a geopolitical fallout on India. Because the Chinese influence in the region will increase, as I mentioned, if US is pulling out of the region or withdrawing from the region. And if the US and China decide to carve out region of influence, then it will become even more difficult for India. That is something you need to keep an eye on. So there are some rocky days ahead for us. But fortunately, India has the leadership. It has the ability to calibrate our policies and to tackle these type of pressures, geopolitical pressures, which will come our way. We have done it before, and I don't see why we can't do it now. And so I think I also feel that given all these pressures, it's about time India started playing a more active geopolitical role. Because if we do not play a geopolitical role in regional conflicts, then countries which are actually playing that role are countries like Turkey, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Qatar, and they are playing that role. And here we are the largest country in the world, we are the 5th largest economy in the world, and we are not yet very keen to play that type of a role. So I think it's important that we step up and start playing a bigger political role globally. And we have already shown the world what we are capable of. You all know during COVID, the vaccine Maitri, which we did during COVID, the climate action which we have taken, we have set up the International Solar Alliance, we are setting up the Biofuels Alliance, the Global Biofuels Alliance. We have digital public infrastructure like India Stack, Aadhaar card, so many things are happening. So we are contributing a lot to the public good. But that is not enough. We need to start taking a proactive role in geopolitics around the world. And I think we have played that role before. I mean, many of you will not remember, even I wasn't born then. This was in the 1950s, when during the Korean War in the 1950s, we were just 4 years as independent country. But during the Korean War, we played a very important role. And because of the role we played to help resolve the Korean War, we were made the chairman of what is called the Neutral Nations Repatriation Committee. So an impoverished country like India in the 1950s, if we can play the role, I'm sure that when we are the 5th largest economy and the world's largest country in the world, we can certainly play a much bigger role. So I think I just wanted to give you a sense of what geopolitics is all about, how geopolitics can affect us, and why it is important for you to look at some of the important hotspots which is happening around the world. So I thank you all once again for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts.